Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and right now I should be coming to you in the middle of April, and very slowly but very surely we are starting to see some signs of life from the film industry. Whether this happens to be major casting announcements made, the fact that some movies are relocating from their original filming locations due to other issues, or merely the encouraging sign that studios are getting their projects back up and running. So all in all, this is a good thing, because if you take a look at the slate of movies that are out right now, it is very much slim pickings. But as always on the GSMC Movie Podcast, I have singled out the ones that I think are most appealing and probably will be most enjoyable for audiences. I will give everyone a bit of a warning. A couple of the films I will be talking about center around drug cartels, because apparently that's just the it thing to make a movie about this year. I've been doing this podcast for going on 2 months, and I'm pretty sure I've covered at least half a dozen films that center around drug cartels, so I guess that is the compelling plot device of 2021. But also on the show, I'm going to be diving into the box office report once again, and I will also be bringing you the latest news in the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. I really have to change that clunky title. But either way, be sure to stick around for both of those features, as well as the films I will be talking about in this podcast. And to give you an idea of what I will be covering in this podcast, I will be starting off with Night of the Sicario, which is one of the films I talked about centering around a drug cartel. And this film tells the story of a DEA agent who is attempting to get 2 key witnesses to a safe location so they can testify against what they have seen. Then, in my next segment, I will be talking about another film that centers around a drug cartel, and that is the new film Vanquish, starring Morgan Freeman and Ruby Rose, which plot centers around Ruby Rose trying to put her past as a drug dealer behind her, but Morgan Freeman, who plays a corrupt cop, has kidnapped her daughter, and is using this as leverage to get her to do his bidding. There is a lot about that film I would love to talk about, so be sure to stick around for that segment. Also, after I give you the GSMC News Report, I'm going to be talking about the new film Monday. And just to change things up, this one does not center around a drug cartel. It is more of a romantic comedy drama type film where a woman is choosing between a vacation romance or going back to her dull career. And again, I do want to be covering a wide range of films, so this is probably best suited for our audience members that are interested in romance films. But it certainly seems to be a compelling film, so be sure to stick around for that. And you're definitely going to want to stick around till our final segment, where I'm going to be taking a look at the films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the biggest gap in terms of ratings from critics and audience members. I got this suggestion from my girlfriend, who found a post on Reddit in the subcategory Data is Beautiful, where someone compiled the list of movies that audiences and critics disagreed on the most. And I'm going to be covering the films where audiences enjoyed them much more than critics. And that will be taking place in our final segment, so be sure to stick around for the whole show of the GSMC Movie Podcast. But we are going to start off this episode as we start off every episode, and that is taking a look at a film from the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die, and today's selection is Apocalypse Now. And before I even get into the film itself, I have to say this is one of those movies where the story of making the film is probably probably more compelling than the film itself, which is saying a lot when you consider that this film is directed by Francis Ford Coppola, who at the time was probably the hottest director in the film industry, given this was the first film he did after The Godfather Part 2. Also, this film boasts legendary actors like Marlon Brando, Robert Duvall, Martin Sheen, Harrison Ford, Dennis Hooper, and even a young Lawrence Fishburne is in the film, who had to lie about how old he was in order to be part of the production. So, Apocalypse Now had everything it needed from a cast and crew standpoint to be a great film, but the stories that have come out about this film being made are so incredible that in 1991, they inspired their own film, Heart of Darkness, which was a documentary detailing how outlandish and crazy the production of this film was. And to just give you an idea of the issues that this production faced, Marlon Brando, who may be one of the most brilliant actors ever to live, was also notorious for being hard to work with. He showed up to the production incredibly out of shape, which is a bit of an issue when he is supposed to be playing a muscular army sergeant. Additionally, Ford Coppola had to deal with a lot of budget issues, as he was way over budget when he was only halfway through filming. And then probably the craziest story to come out of this film's production is the fact that Martin Sheen suffered cardiac arrest while on the set. And in the absolute most extreme example of the show must go on, he would continue to film after suffering a heart attack. So don't let anyone tell you actors are soft. But if you are interested in hearing more about the crazy stories that came along with the making of Apocalypse Now, definitely check out the documentary Heart of Darkness. But back to our main feature, Apocalypse Now, which is one of the 1001 movies you must see before you die. Let's talk about why it is. The movie centers around Martin Sheen's character, Captain Willard, having to hunt down Marlon Brando's character, Colonel Kurtz, who has essentially gone rogue, and this whole film is built around the two of them facing off in an ultimate showdown. Now, as this was a film about war, released so close to the Vietnam War, directed by Ford Coppola, who was very anti-war, but the script was written by someone named John Milius, who was pro-war. This coupling of opposite agendas actually made the film a masterclass in philosophy surrounding the merits and objections to warfare. So Apocalypse Now is not only a thought-provoking film, but it's also shot in stunning fashion, which was pretty much a calling card of for Coppola in the 70s. Filmed on location in the Philippines, this provided a incredible environment to shoot a war film in, and while there's no experience that can really compare to the horrors you see in warfare, for Coppola essentially wanted this to be a method movie, and for it to capture the authentic feel of Vietnam. Now, it is pretty hard to capture the authenticity of a real-life war, but the cast definitely went through hell making this film. Luckily for them, it did not go unrecognized, as the film was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor for Robert Duvall, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Direction, and Best Film Editing, and even won Best Cinematography and Best Sound. So this film has definitely carved out its space in cinema history, and is definitely worthy of inclusion in terms of being in the book 1001 movies you must see before you die. And to all of you interested in viewing Apocalypse Now, it is now streaming on Hulu. So if you do subscribe to that platform, be sure to check it out. And for those of you who are not subscribers, it's $6 a month. What do you have to lose? But there you have it. The classic of the week to check out is Apocalypse Now. But shifting gears to a film that hopes to become a classic, which I guess is the goal of any movie. But this one, Night of the Sicario, will be hitting theaters in a limited capacity starting Friday, April 16th. And this film, like I mentioned in the intro, is about a DEA agent who is trying to keep a father and daughter safe from a drug cartel, which they have witnessed doing nefarious things. And while they are being transported to a secure location, they are ambushed by this cartel, and the father sustains a bullet wound. But despite that, they do survive the encounter and are forced to seek refuge in a nearby house. But by no means does this mean they are out of the woods, as they constantly have to deal with people coming after them. Hence the title, Night of the Sicario, which Sicario, roughly translated in English, means hitman. Now, while the premise for this film seems pretty straightforward, as it paints it to be a pretty much classic shoot-'em-up film, there does seem to be a rather compelling backstory. And while I'm sure most of the on-screen action is going to be gunfighting and hand-to-hand combat, the real emotion of this film is going to come from protecting the young girl, which is not going to be a simple cast when you consider that pretty much all she has to defend her is the DEA agent who's transporting the family, her father who has already suffered a bullet wound, and the owner of the house they seek refuge in, who seems as though she's simply being swept up into this madness. And I'm sure somewhere in the subtext of this movie, there's a message in there about protecting the innocent and the innocence of a child, not exposing them to the horrors that this world is capable of. But it seems as though the young girl will be getting a sort of baptism by fire in this film, which in turn could be interpreted as kids today have more information presented to them than at any point in human history, both good and bad. But who really knows the message the filmmakers are really trying to send? The only thing that is really certain is that this film is meant to be an action-packed thrill ride that keeps you guessing and on the edge of your seat until the very end of the film. And there is a good chance that they deliver on that proposition when you consider this film is really a hunter versus the hunted type film, much in the vein of Terminator. And I'm sure there are other films that follow that format, but I really can't think of other ones worth mentioning aside from Terminator 2, which I just feel is a little redundant naming two films from the same series, even if they do completely nail the story structure that they're going for. Now, am I saying that Night of the Sicario is going to be as good a film as Terminator? Of course not, but it does have the same structure where there are going to be people that have been marked for death. There are going to be people coming after them, which will make for a lot of suspenseful moments throughout the film. There are going to be close calls. There are going to be moments where you think all hope is lost. And here in 2021, filmmakers know what has been put to screen, they know what audiences are expecting, and more than ever, they are playing with the idea of subversion. And just because someone is a main character doesn't guarantee they're going to make it through to the end of the story, which I guess we can call the Game of Thrones effect. And while the little girl is probably going to be the most major plot device in the film, the main character appears to be Natasha Hedstrom's character of Taylor Ward, and good for Natasha because this appears to be her first leading role. Now, she has had a very long career and has a lot of credits to her name, but probably the most notable production she's ever been a part of is the Bruce Willis film, The Whole Nine Yards, where she played Cynthia, and you will probably have to tell me if that was a major role or not in that film, because I was 6 at the time it debuted in theaters, and I have never heard a compelling reason as to why that film would be worth going back and watching. But good for Natasha that she is carrying the show in this one, and hopefully this creates some sort of a launching pad for her career. Now, her main co-star in this film is Costas Mandylor, who plays Cole Bennett, the DEA agent charged with protecting the young girl and her father as they're being transported to safety. Unfortunately for him, he runs into a few complications and is now also tasked with having to protect the young girl from the plethora of assassins that are coming after them. And for those of you curious about Mandylor's career, he is probably best known for his involvement in the Saw franchise, where he plays Hoffman. Other than that, I don't think many people will know who this guy is. Now, someone else in this film, audiences will be unaware of who they are, is the young Addison Kendall, and that's because this is her acting debut. She will be playing Amelia Fuentes, the young girl who is the one the other characters are trying to protect from this army of hitmen. Now, I'm unsure how old Addison Kendall is, but from the looks of her, she can't be much older than a preteen, and I think it's just all the more impressive that she is making her acting debut in a film where she is going to have to tap into a lot of powerful emotions, including fear. So, best of luck to Addison Kendall in the first installment of her acting career. And the more I think about her name, I really think it should be the other way around. She has a last name as a first name and a first name as a last name. But whatever, actors have weird names. So anyway, for anyone interested in seeing the film, Night of the Sicario, it will be released into theaters on a limited basis starting Friday, April 16th, and the film is rated R. So if you are a fan of the action suspense thriller, then this film is right up your alley, and be sure to check it out. Right now, however, I am going to be taking a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast, but don't go anywhere, because coming up, I am going to be talking about the new film, Vanquish, which stars Ruby Rose as an ex-drug dealer who's trying to forget her past, but Morgan Freeman plays a corrupt cop, and he has kidnapped her daughter. So if her character is ever interested in seeing her daughter again, she has to comply with his orders and do his bidding for him. That film sounds compelling on multiple levels. One in particular is Morgan Freeman going against his typecast and playing the villain. So it'll be fun to talk about that in our next segment. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, because I was recently shown a graphic about the films on Rotten Tomatoes that the critics and audiences disagree on the most. And I'm going to be taking a look at the films that audiences enjoyed much more than the critics. This should be a fun topic for many reasons, mainly just seeing which films made this list in the first place and speculate at the possible reasons why there's such a big disconnect between audiences and critics. So be sure to stick around until the end of the show for that topic, and be sure to stick around for our next segment as the GSMC Movie Podcast. We'll be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in the last segment, we covered the new film, Night of the Sicario, and Sicario, again, translates roughly to hitman, and this film tells a story of a father and daughter who are being transported to a safe location because the wife and mother has witnessed the activities of a drug cartel, and she's going to testify in open court against them. But unfortunately, while they are in transit, they are beset by this drug cartel. They do survive, with the father sustaining a bullet wound, and they are then forced to seek refuge in a house of someone the DEA agent is familiar with. So, while she didn't volunteer for that job, she is now a part of keeping this little girl safe from the plethora of hitmen that are coming after her. So, for anyone who is a fan of the action, suspense, thriller type film, Night of the Sicario should be right up your alley. And if that is the case, be sure to check out the film when it hits theaters Friday, April 16th. But I will say, viewer discretion advised, as the film is rated R, because this is a good old-fashioned shoot 'em up, and what you will be seeing on screen will be fairly graphic. So, once again, viewer discretion advised. And I will probably also be giving that advice for the film I'm going to be taking a look at in this segment, which is the new film Vanquish, whose plot also centers around the dealings of a drug cartel. The film stars Ruby Rose and Morgan Freeman, and I will be getting more into the film later in the segment, but I do want to continue the trend of giving you the box office report to let you all know which films are performing well and which films have turned out to be absolute duds. Now, of course, with the box office numbers, there are a ton of mediating factors. Most notably, we are still in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, but also most films that are getting released in theaters are also being released on streaming platforms at the same time. So there is a bit of market cannibalization there. but we are just going to be looking at these numbers in a vacuum and checking out the raw totals of what these theatrical releases are bringing in. So without further ado, let's get into the box office report, and I'm going to be covering the week of April 2nd through April 8th. And it should be no surprise to anybody that Godzilla vs. Kong is still dominating the box office. It is probably the film that appeals to most audiences. It has been released in the most theaters across the country, and it without a doubt has the most epic premise of any film going right now. All these factors have resulted in the film raking in over $32 million domestically, bringing its overall box office performance above $56 million. And when you factor in how it's performing around the globe, it has surpassed Tenet as the highest drawing movie in the pandemic era, having accumulated a box office of over $338 million worldwide, which means it has more than doubled its original budget of $160 million. And at this moment, there seems to be absolutely no signs of this film slowing down in terms of box office earnings, because it is without a doubt the most appealing film on the movie schedule right now. So all of those signs that relate to Godzilla vs. Kong has to be encouraging for the film industry as a whole, and this is hopefully a sign of things getting back to normal from a movie release standpoint. Now, of course, Godzilla vs. Kong is a major blockbuster tentpole film, so this certainly isn't going to be the norm when it comes to the average movie release. But the simple behavior of audience members and moviegoers that they are willing to go see something in a theater to the point where a film is already surpassed the $500,000 mark has to be encouraging. And it is also encouraging that independent films are making a modest profit at the box office, as the new horror film Unholy made over $4 million in its debut week and was the second highest grossing film of the week. And The Unholy is a religious-themed horror film where a little girl is actually visited by the Virgin Mary, then can perform miracles, but eventually sinister things begin to happen. And as one can imagine, the truth on whether or not this girl is actually contacted by the Virgin Mary is called into question. I'm sure with that film coinciding with Easter Sunday had something to do with its relative success at the box office, as Unholy was able to gross over $4 million in its debut week, just edging out the new Bob Odenkirk film Nobody, which made just slightly less despite playing in more theaters. But those factors aside, Nobody still was able to clear $4 million that week and was one of only 3 films to accomplish that feat. Additionally, last week contributed to Nobody's running total to be nearly $13 million, which has brought it into the top 10 grossing films released during the pandemic era. So props to them for that. Now, the 5th highest grossing film released during the pandemic era, Raya and the Last Dragon, is still performing fairly well at the box office, raking in close to $3 million last week, which is all the more impressive when you consider this film is also available through Disney+. So not only is this film having to compete with the other theatrical releases, it is having to compete with itself on a smaller, more convenient and accessible platform. But that has not stopped Raya and the Last Dragon from raking in over $33 million at the box office. Another film that is still doing respectable numbers at the box office is the Tom and Jerry film, which has made over $39 million total, and last week was able to bring in close to $1.5 million. So the main analysis I'm getting from the top performing movies at the box office is you either need giant monsters fighting with each other, an action movie with a lot of fight scenes, or a horror film that is going to keep the audience on the edge of their seat throughout, or you have to be appealing to the younger demographic, which, come to think of it, is a pretty accurate synopsis of the film industry in general right now. But that does not mean there can't be surprises in the film industry. For example, last week, a film I had not even heard of was nowhere on my radar. Did not see it on any of the sites that I check out for research for the show. And that was the film The Little Girl Who Believes in Miracles. It was only released in 640 theaters, but that did not stop it from drawing in over $700,000 and being the sixth highest grossing film of the week. And it is a tad ironic that I mentioned the film Unholy earlier, because this seems to be the G-rated wholesome version of that, where a girl prays to God, her prayers are answered. Only in this film, nothing nefarious is going on, and it's just a good old feel-good story, regardless of how cheesy the premise is. But this film is doing relatively well at the box office. But other than the films I've mentioned, there is not much else to cover in the box office report. The film The Courier is the only one that made over $600,000 last week. And another film we covered on the podcast, French Exit, is doing absolutely miserably. It has made just over $250,000 and cannot outperform a film like The Croods: A New Age, which has been in theaters pretty much since Christmas. So I apologize for covering that film on this podcast and directing anybody to go see it. But hopefully you found something to enjoy about it, and the more I do this box office report and check out what audiences are responding to, I'm going to have a better sense of what films to cover going forward. So that will do it for the box office report, and I am going to talk about a film that I really think is going to be enjoyable, and that is the new release, Vanquish. This film stars Morgan Freeman as a housebound former police commissioner who is on a bit of the corrupt side of things, with Ruby Rose playing his caretaker, who also has a rather unfortunate past of being a drug dealer. And despite her best efforts to put this aspect of her life behind her, for the sake of both her and her daughter, things are not always that simple in rated R movies about drug cartels. So unfortunately for her, Morgan Freeman kidnaps her daughter in order to get Ruby Rose's character to embrace her old life and intercept major drug transactions in order to get her daughter back. So there is a lot of meat on that premise bone. And possibly my favorite aspect of this film is that Morgan Freeman is going to be playing the bad guy. He always gives off that trustworthy grandfather figure in his roles, and need I say more about his voice and how it just is a reassuring presence whenever he speaks? So it will be quite compelling to see him playing the bad guy and really going to extreme lengths in order to get what he wants, especially involving a child in all this. And this film may prove to be quite refreshing, because I can't imagine that a Morgan Freeman villain is going to be very bombastic and all over the place to the point of being manic. So seeing an on-screen bad guy taking more of the reserved, laid-back, and calculating type role could be a lot of fun. And I just have to take a moment to give all the props to Morgan Freeman. This man really came from nothing. Started his career on The Electric Company, which was a show in the 70s about teaching kids basic math and writing skills. And from there, he has turned himself into one of the most recognizable, acclaimed, and beloved actors of his generation. So he has accomplished all that and is still going strong at the age of 83. So, a tip of the cap to Morgan Freeman, who in recent years is probably best known for his involvement in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. And I use that term recently very loosely, considering the last of those films came out in 2012. Boy, oh boy, am I getting old. But it is a little ironic that he is starring in a film opposite Ruby Rose, who played Batwoman on the CW TV series. She has also appeared in such blockbuster action films as John Wick Chapter 2 and Vin Diesel's Triple X, Return of Xander Kane. So she obviously has the ability to perform in incredibly physically demanding roles. And just for fun, I want to mention that she was also in the incredibly wonderful yet completely awful film, The Meg, where she played Jax, who was part of the team charged with hunting down and killing a megalodon. And I know that that movie had an incredibly high budget and was supposed to be essentially this generation's version of Jaws, but that movie is just so terrible on so many fronts but it has that car crash effect where you just can't look away from it. So if we are talking about our favorite Ruby Rose's projects, I'm going to go with The Meg. But hopefully her performance in Vanquish will contribute to audiences taking this film a little bit more seriously. And after talking about this film, it kind of just occurred to me that I have talked about two different films on this podcast where the story revolves around protecting a young girl, and the plot heavily features the activity of drug cartels. So I guess that plot point and that type of story structure is really the flavor of the month in the film industry when it comes to producing a thrilling action movie. But I do think Vanquish has a lot going for it. I think Ruby Rose has the physicality needed to play an action hero, and with Morgan Freeman's involvement in the film, need I say more? He always gives a terrific performance despite the quality of the film that he is in. When you take those two elements and combine them with a whole bunch of action set pieces and major stunts, you are in for a real treat as an audience member. So for all those interested in checking out the new film Vanquish, I once again do have to say viewer discretion is advised as this film is rated R, but for all of you that are able to see the film, it will be released in theaters on a limited basis Friday, April 16th, and will be released on video on demand not soon after, but that date is still to be determined. So if you are one of the brave souls heading back into theaters, I highly recommend you check out the new film Vanquish. Right now, however, on the GSMC Movie Podcast, I am going to be taking a quick break, but be sure to stick around because coming up in our next segment, I will be giving the GSMC Movie Podcast news report about different things that have been announced in the film industry. I most certainly have some comments about Kevin James being cast as Saints coach Sean Payton in a new Netflix film made about the coach's life while he was suspended from the NFL. I just can't believe Netflix would do him dirty like that. But I am also going to be talking about the new film Monday, which is more of a romantic comedy drama. So for everyone who is a fan of that type of film, be sure to stick around to hear what I have to say about that. And definitely be sure to stick around until the end of the show, where I am going to be talking about the films that have the biggest disconnect on Rotten Tomatoes between critics and audience members. This topic was brought to my attention by my girlfriend, who showed me a graphic of someone who had compiled all the films that had the biggest disconnect between critics and audience members on Rotten Tomatoes, and I felt this topic was definitely worth taking a closer look at. So at the end of the show, I'm going to be taking a look at the films where audience members enjoyed films way more than the critics did. So be sure to stick around. We have all that and more coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast, which will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I finished talking about the new film Vanquish, which stars Ruby Rose as an ex-drug dealer who is trying to put that aspect of her life behind her for the sake of her daughter, but that daughter ends up being kidnapped by Morgan Freeman's character, a corrupt former police commissioner who wants to use Rose's character's skills and connection into the drug world to intercept the payments on major drug deals. So this film has a fairly compelling story, and seeing Morgan Freeman play the bad guy for a change will be very interesting. So if you are interested in checking out this action-packed thrill ride, Vanquish will be released in theaters starting Friday, April 16th. So be sure to check it out. Shifting gears on this segment, I will be talking about the new romance drama, Monday, starring Sebastian Stan and Denise Gauff. So be sure to stick around for that, and be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I'm going to be taking a look at films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the biggest gap in terms of their ratings from both audiences and critics. And I will be looking into the list of films that audiences enjoyed much more than critics. So you are not going to want to miss that. But right now, I'm going to be starting off this segment with the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report, where I talk about different things going on in the film industry. And I am going to be starting off this installment of the news report on a bit of a rant, because it was announced that Kevin James is going to star in a film called The Home Team, which will be a Netflix original, and he is going to be playing NFL coach Sean Payton. The movie is supposed to be set during the time where Sean Payton was suspended from the NFL due to Bountygate, which, for those who don't know, was a time where it was discovered that the New Orleans Saints football team was essentially paying for injuring other players, to the point where one member of the Saints organization offered $25,000 for anyone who could take Brett Favre out of the 2009 NFC Championship game. Now, this story was a tad overblown, as things like this were not uncommon in NFL locker rooms. The Saints just really took it to an extreme and got caught doing it. But this resulted in Sean Payton having to face a year-long suspension. During that time, while he was waiting to be reinstated by the NFL, he decided to be the offensive coordinator for his son's 6th grade Pop Warner football team. So the film is going to be covering the events during that year off. And about this film, good for Sean Payton for selling his life rights and profiting off a pretty low point in his career. But Netflix, when it comes to all the people you could have cast, why in God's name is it Kevin James? I understand that he is a friend of Adam Sandler and probably has a major multi-picture deal with Netflix, so this is just one of those that's checking off his boxes. But what is it about this guy that makes people think he still has mainstream drawing power? He was someone who was never that funny to begin with. His entire comedic career is just built around the fact, hey, look, he's fat and trying to do stuff. And when I stop for a moment and just think of the projects he's been in, I have no idea which ones of them have actually been a success from both a critical and a commercial standpoint. I'll give him that Grown Ups drew a lot of money, but of the people in that film, I guarantee you audiences weren't turning out for Kevin James. And the only reason I can think of for him still getting cast in major movies, even though this is a Netflix original, so you can debate on how major it is, but he must be one of those actors who just has a sweet spot with the G-rated crowd. But even if that is true, Netflix, why do you have to do Sean Payton like that? He's a nice guy. He doesn't deserve this. But when it comes down to it, there's nothing any of us can do about this casting, so my only hope is Kevin James doesn't make Sean Payton look like a complete and utter buffoon. But that is probably an inevitability if we take a look at James's past roles as any guide. So I am sorry, Sean Payton, but I hope this slapstick G-rated comedy is worth selling your rights over. But shifting to a bit more serious industry news, Will Smith has pulled the production of his next film, Emancipation, out of the state of Georgia. And the reason for the change in shooting location came from the recent controversial voter rights laws that have been passed in the state, which a lot of people are saying is going to make it hard for larger voter turnout in the state. So for that reason, Will Smith and the producers at Apple Studios didn't want to contribute to the state's economy by filming a major film there, and they are now looking for a new filming location for the movie Emancipation, with Buffalo having already thrown their name into the ring for that. So, we are going to have to wait and see how the rest of this story unfolds. But in other news, we go back to referencing the films that Netflix is turning out, and one with Adam Sandler in it, Spaceman, has just added Carey Mulligan to the cast, who most people will probably know from her recent show-stealing performance in Promising Young Woman. And in this new Netflix original, she will be playing the wife of Adam Sandler's protagonist astronaut character. And while the idea of having Adam Sandler play an astronaut sounds like a comedy, this is supposed to be a drama. Which I really do have to commend Adam Sandler after having such an illustrious career as a comedic actor. Even though it most definitely tapered off in recent years, he is now exploring what it's like to be a dramatic actor, with roles such as Uncut Gems, and apparently this next one in Spaceman, which again recently announced Carey Mulligan would be joining the cast. And to talk about some speculative casting, Sebastian Stan, who I will be talking about more on later in this segment, given that he is the star of this segment's feature film Monday, recently said that he wants to play iconic wrestler Ric Flair in a biopic to be made about the Nature Boy. And as much as I would love to see a biopic made about the life of Nature Boy Ric Flair, I'm not sure if Sebastian Stan would be the right casting choice for it. I've only seen Stan play somewhat brooding individuals, and I'm not sure if he has the unhinged charisma that it would take to pull off a convincing performance of the Nature Boy. But who knows, if he's given the chance, he could surprise us all. And wrestling biopics are becoming more and more popular, with Chris Hemsworth slated to play Hulk Hogan in the biopic to be made about that legendary wrestler. So whatever the casting choices are, I am all for movies being made about wrestlers because those people off camera have some of the greatest stories ever told. So good luck to Sebastian Stan getting his dream of being cast as Ric Flair. And of course, I'm sure if he ever gets that role, there will be a lot of split opinions on his casting, which is very common with any role. For instance, if we take a look at Ridley Scott's upcoming House of Gucci film, the Gucci family is criticizing the casting of Al Pacino as Maurizio Gucci. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Don't care enough about Gucci as a person to find out if I'm pronouncing that right. But Patrizia Gucci appears to be one of these offsprings that has lived off the family name her entire life and has seemingly accomplished nothing on her own outside of being part of the Lucky Sperm Club. She has been making waves saying that casting Al Pacino as the patriarch of the Gucci family was a terrible decision because he does not look anything like her grandfather. Now let's just take a step back and take a look at this complaint. This is a girl who has probably never worked a day in her life, and she is taking issue with the fact an Academy Award-winning actor has been cast to play her grandfather. The film has not been released yet. She has not seen the performance, so she doesn't even know if he does him justice or not. So these complaints are pretty much just the pinnacle of first world problems, which essentially is saying that an Academy Award-winning actor is not worthy enough to play my grandfather in the biopic made about his life. If only we all could be so lucky. But for all of you interested in checking out House of Gucci yourself and judging whether or not Al Pacino's performance is any good, the film is slated to be released this November. But moving on to other casting news, the 5th installment of Indiana Jones has just added Mads Mikkelsen to the cast, which already includes the legendary Harrison Ford as the titular Indiana Jones and Phoebe Waller-Bridges. My only hope for this one is it is better than the 4th one. And I should really be wrapping up this segment, so I will just drop 2 more pieces of information. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness has finished filming, but the film is still almost a year away from being released, because as one would imagine, this film will require a buttload of special effects. And another film that will probably require a whole ton of special effects, but will probably still end up looking terrible, is The Meg 2, The Trench, which is the sequel to the giant shark blockbuster, The Meg. The film has been confirmed and will be returning most of the original cast, including Jason Statham and Ruby Rose. I am super excited for this film, and yes, I am fully aware just how terrible the first one of these was, but there is just something about a bad movie that takes itself too seriously that just hits the spot. So I am pumped for The Meg 2, The Trench. Probably the only person on the planet that would say that aloud. But that will do it for this installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. And I've gone way over, so I really have to be succinct when talking about the new feature film, which is Monday. And like I said in the news report, this film stars Sebastian Stan, who most people will know from his involvement in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as the Winter Soldier. And in this film, he essentially plays a party boy who falls for someone he just met in Athens. The person he falls for is played by Denise Gow, who is probably best known for her involvement in series like The Witcher. But in this film, the two of them have a sort of love at first sight romance, where they spend pretty much the entire weekend just partying and being in each other's company. But they are going to have to make a choice once the weekend is over and Monday comes around on whether or not they are going to continue this lifestyle or go back to the lives they were living before they met each other. So this film is very much in the vein of a rom-com and provides the audience with a little bit of escapism, because who hasn't had that vacation they wish never ends, but inevitably we all have to get back to the lives we were leading before we went on vacation. And that is one of the main reasons that people hate Mondays and why this film is titled Monday. But like I said, this film Monday is supposed to be a little bit of wish fulfillment for the audience members, and I would imagine the audience for this film is predominantly female. But who's to say? There could be a large segment of the male audience who would be interested in seeing Sebastian Stan engage in a weekend fling, and more power to those people. But while Sebastian Stan is probably the top billed and most recognizable actor in the film, the main character of the film is Denise Goff's character. And her character of Chloe is saddled with a very old film trope, and that's choosing between the sustainable life where you have a career, you have a solid income, and then in turn that allows you to sustain your life over a longer period of time. Or she could choose throwing that all away for an experience that essentially makes life worth living for and makes her feel alive. And that is what she has found in Sebastian Stan's character of Mickey, someone who just makes her enjoy life and helps her live in the moment, which by no means is a new type of story structure. But in the times we are living in, I think more and more people are looking things that really make them enjoy life and believe life is worth living, aside from just toiling away at a job or career. And that is most likely the message that this film Monday is trying to relay to audiences. Instead of just working for the sake of working and because it's something you need to sustain your life, take a moment and ask yourself, what is the point of all that if you're not living your life the way you want to? So that is going to be the main question that the character Chloe is going to be asking herself throughout the film Monday, which for anyone interested in seeing, the film will be released in theaters on a limited basis, as well as available via video on demand starting April 16th. So by the time you are listening to this podcast, you will be able to go and see it. So if you are a fan of the existential romantic comedy, be sure to check out the new film Monday. Right now, however, I'm going to be taking a quick break on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but be sure to stick around as we have a great topic for our fourth and final segment. And this topic was suggested to me by my girlfriend, who saw a graphic on Reddit under the subcategory Data is Beautiful, which I will say is a very interesting subreddit to be subscribed to. But nonetheless, there was a post of someone compiling the films on Rotten Tomatoes where audience members disagreed the most with the critics when it comes to rating a film. And in our final segment, I'm going to be taking a look at the films that audiences enjoyed much more than the critics. The graphic did also include the films that the critics liked much more than audience members, which I will say is probably more commonplace. But through this entire exercise, we have to remember that audience members and critics are looking at films under completely different lenses and are looking for completely different things when they go to the movies. But whatever those factors are when it comes to viewing a movie, we're going to take a look at 10 films that critics and audience members had the biggest disconnect when it comes to rating the films on Rotten Tomatoes, while taking a look at possible reasons for the disconnect, and ultimately make the judgment of which group I think got the rating correct. So stick around, we have that coming up on the fourth and final segment of the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Back into the fourth and final segment of the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in the last segment, I finished talking about the film Monday, which pairs up Sebastian Stan and Denise Gough in a romantic comedy where the two have a whirlwind of a romantic weekend, but each have to face the harsh reality that is everyday life when Monday rolls around. For anyone interested in taking in a new romantic comedy, the film is set for release in theaters on a limited basis, as well as being available on video on demand, starting Friday, March 16th. So by the time you are listening to this podcast, you will be able to check it out. Early reviews for the film are a bit mixed, so you'll have to check it out to give your own opinion. And in our final segment, I'm going to be taking a look at just that, the differing opinions that critics have with audiences when it comes to rating a film. And I have to give credit where credit is due to Reddit user u/lookatnum, who is the one that compiled this graphic of films on Rotten Tomatoes where there's the biggest disconnect between audience members and critics when it comes to rating a film. So thank you for that. And in this segment, I'm going to let you know what those films are and give a couple thoughts on whether or not they are deserving of the ratings and speculate on why there is such a big disconnect in the first place. Now, he did compile two lists, one where the audience members enjoyed films much more than the critics, and vice versa. In this segment, we are going to be covering the films where the audiences had the films higher rated than the critics. This will be structured like a pretty typical top 10 list, and I'm going to start with number 10 and work my way forward. And without further ado, let's get into it. The number 10 film that had the biggest disconnect when it came to audiences versus critic ratings is Terminator Genisys. And just to clarify, just because there is a large disconnect on the rating that was given by both audiences and critics doesn't mean either of them thought the film was any good. This film has a very low audience score of 53%, whereas the critics' rating was 27%, which gives Terminator Genisys a gap of 26% overall. And I don't know if anyone else remembers the promos for this film, but it feels like this movie was advertised for like a straight year trying to get people to go see it. It did boast the return of Arnold Schwarzenegger to the Terminator franchise, along with his CGI body double, as well as having Emilia Clarke in a leading role when she was one of the most popular and recognizable faces on the planet. So from the star power in the film, I can understand why the audiences rated it as high as they did, even though its rating overall is pretty terrible. But when it comes to the Terminator's series of films, I guess the critics are holding it to a higher standard than the audience that went to see it, so it is hard to fault them for rating the film as low as they did, but I guess this kind of led to a good thing, given that James Cameron returned to oversee production of the next Terminator film, Dark Fate. But for those keeping score at home, neither audiences nor critics gave Terminator Genisys a high rating, but I have to score one for the critics, as I believe their 27% ranking is more accurate to the quality of the film, and the reason audience members gave it as high a ranking as they did is purely off of nostalgia. So, the critics jump out to a 1-0 lead, and the audience scores hope to tie it up with the next film, which is Justice League. And this is the original that hit theaters in 2017. Audiences gave it a ranking of 71, whereas critics gave it a ranking of 40, with the difference being 31 percentage points. And to be honest, I really don't know who had this right. I'm of the whole opinion the DC Extended Universe is just one giant mess that keeps building on top of itself, and the original release of the Justice League is just part of that. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, this will not be the final time we talk about the DCEU in this segment. But since there has to be a winner in terms of rating and which one is more on the nose, I once again have to give it to the critics and their much lower rating than the audience for this film. Of course, now that the Snyder Cut has been released, we're all aware of the issues that plagued the production of the first one. But circumstances aside, that doesn't stop the original product from being an unmitigated disaster. From Superman's CGI upper lip to the over-reliance on quippy dialogue. The original release of Justice League didn't have much in terms of bright spots, so I'm once again going to have to side with the critics and their much lower rating. So tack one on for the critics. The next film on this list is Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales, which had an audience rating of 61% and a critical rating of 29%, with a difference of 32 percentage points. And this is another film on this list that really didn't receive high ratings from either group, but I certainly understand why audience members were much more favorable when rating the fourth installment of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, with nostalgia and familiarity playing a big role in why it got such a higher rating from audience members than critics. But unfortunately, I think I once again have to give it to the critics on this one. This film was simply a cash grab, so much so that Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley didn't even bother turning up for it, and there wasn't much of a story other than letting Johnny Depp do his Captain Jack Sparrow character and letting Javier Bardem play a scary CGI monster. So right now it is the critics 3 and the audience's 0. But in at number 7, it appears we have a film that I'm going to side with the audience and their rating of the film Passengers, where the consensus audience score is 63%. And the consensus critic rating is 30%, with a difference of 33 percentage points. Now, I will give the critics that this film was a bit heavy-handed in the metaphor of Adam and Eve, with the story revolving around Chris Pratt and Jennifer Lawrence's characters hurtling through space on a ship that is seeking new inhabitable worlds. But I do think the main conflict of Chris Pratt's character waking up Jennifer Lawrence's character prematurely makes for a great central drama. And while the film Passengers did drag at certain points, I think the audience is much closer to the bone on this one and their rating of the film overall. So for all of you keeping score, chalk one up for the audience ratings. And moving right along to the next film on this list, we have David Ayer's Suicide Squad, which had an audience rating of 59% and a critic rating of 26%, with the difference being 33 percentage points. And I am going to be far more blunt on this film than I have been on the other ones. This movie flat out sucked. I did mention earlier that the DCEU is just one big giant mess, and I think this film is the ultimate example of that. The final product was clunky and not very entertaining. The best thing you can say about this film is that it inspired a whole bunch of Halloween costumes, but as a narrative, it is just flat out awful. It is very heavy-handed with the exposition, explaining who everybody is without any real reason to, other than we have to tell the audience. DC clearly just tried to copy the success that Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy experienced, and this is evident by them flipping from dad rock song to dad rock song at a clip of pretty much one every 20 seconds. The CGI in this film was terrible, and the plot as a whole was very unoriginal. So the critics giving this a rating of 26%, I think, is kind to the movie Suicide Squad. But because that is the lower of the two scores I can side with, I will be siding with the critical response on this one. So the score is 4-1 in favor of the critical response, and that was not even the final DCEU film we are going to be talking about, as the next film is Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, which somehow has a lower audience score than Justice League at 63 and a lower critical response of 29% with a difference of 33 percentage points. So before I get into the audience versus critical rating, I just want to say there's no way that this film should deserve a lower rating on either front compared to the original Justice League, because the original Justice League was a complete mess, and while this film is by no means perfect, Batman vs. Superman at least had some awesome moments in it. The final showdown with Doomsday was sensory overload. Ben Affleck as Batman, he turned in a tremendous performance, and while it did have the poorly reasoned, not so well explained plot point of Batman changing his mind because his mother and Superman's mother share the same name, it is without a doubt a better film than the original Justice League. So I'm going to side with the audience on this one and say that they more accurately judged Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. But moving right along, coming up on this list, we have 3 straight entries from Disney, the first of which being Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, with audiences giving this film a rating of 86% out of 100 on Rotten Tomatoes, and critics giving the film a mere 51% with a difference of 35 percentage points. Now on this one, I'm very inclined to give it to the critical response because this film was not very good or compelling, and like many of the new Star Wars films, it just recycled old tropes from the originals. Now the film did have a few moments, but overall, giving it a rating of 86%, essentially saying this is a B-plus movie. I just don't see it, considering this film had to be the end of a trilogy, and essentially they just had to force things into place in order to reach their conclusion point. So for those keeping score at home, it is critical ratings 5 and audience ratings 2. And the next film we have up is I guess we'll call it the live adaptation of The Lion King, which was released in 2019 and has since racked up an audience score of 88% on Rotten Tomatoes, whereas the critics have rated it 52% with a difference of 36 percentage points. And I can't understand why the critics rated it so low, given that I doubt there was much difference in terms of the plot, because for all intents and purposes, the one released in 2019 and the one released in 1994 are the same film that are simply told through different mediums. So I can understand if the critics took away points on originality because of that, but just taking a look at the sheer visuals that were brought to life in this remake of The Lion King is really amazing. To think that computers are capable of making animals that, for all intents and purposes, seem real. So if we are to strip down to the very basic concepts of what makes a good film, and that is the quality of images committed to screen, the 2019 version of The Lion King scores through the roof on that front. So on this one, I have to say that the audience members were closer to assessing the real quality of this film. Now, if only that was the same case for the next Disney film on this list, which is the live-action adaptation of Aladdin. This film was also released in 2019, and for some reason has garnered a 94 consensus audience rating, while also accumulating a 57% critical rating, with there being a difference of 37 percentage points between these two ratings. And I do have to say, on this film installment, If the audience is enjoying themselves, what's the point of quarreling over that? But this film has a higher audience rating than 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I don't care how good people think this film is, you can't replace Robin Williams as the genie, and doing so with Will Smith, who has had a string of very terrible movies in recent years, does nothing in way of enhancing a film, as the actor once had that effect on every project he was a part of. So, on the 2019 version of Aladdin, I have to side with the critics' rating of 57%, bringing the score to 6 for the critical rating and 3 for the audience ratings. So the critics have already won this little exercise, but just for fun, let's go into the final film, and that is Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen, which has the second lowest audience rating of any film on this list of 57% and has the absolute lowest critical rating of any film on this list, with a 20% average rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I'm not sure why this Transformer film draws so much hate from both audiences and critics, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this film was made solely to capitalize on the success of the first one, and with that, it had a very underdeveloped plot, and considering Megan Fox was in it, I'm sure the acting wasn't too great either. But this film is a big Hollywood blockbuster, and all those things are usually sacrificed in the name of spectacle. So for those purposes, I am going to side with the audience rating on this one, because while I'm sure the film is not that great, I have a hard time believing it is worthy of a 20% rating. So we have a final score of 6-4, with the critics coming out on top. In a future episode, I'm going to have to do the list of films with the biggest divide between audience and critic ratings, where the critics liked films much more than audiences did. But for now, I am going to have to be wrapping things up here on the GSMC Movie Podcast. Once again, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I do want to thank everyone who is listening to this podcast. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you're always notified when a new episode comes out. If you could go ahead and also write us a nice review, those really help us a lot. And be sure to follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But that will do it for me here on the GSMC Movie Podcast. I have been your host, Rich McDonough, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.